The story of Stalag Luft III does not begin with a tunnel. It begins with the sound of a forest being murdered. In the spring of 1942, the Nazi Luftwaffe selected a desolate patch of pine woods near Sagan, in what was then Lower Silesia. The German High Command had a specific vision. They wanted to create a VIP cage for the most troublesome Allied officers, the pilots, navigators, and bomb aimers who had already proven they were escape-prone. These were men who viewed the barbed wire not as an end to their war, but as a new front line. To break their spirit, the Germans designed a camp that was a masterpiece of architectural paranoia. They cleared the trees to ensure a 360-degree field of fire for the machine gun towers. They buried seismic microphones, state-of-the-art acoustic sensors, deep into the earth to listen for the rhythmic scratch of a shovel. And most importantly, they chose a location with a ground composed almost entirely of bright volcanic yellow sand. This yellow sand was the camp's most silent and effective guard. In every other prisoner of war camp, a man could dig a hole and hide the dirt under a barrack. But at Stalag Luft III, the surface soil was a dull grey-brown. The moment a shovel pierced the crust and hit the yellow sand beneath, the contrast was like a scream in a silent room. A single grain of yellow sand on a prisoner's uniform, or a grey path was enough to send a man to the cooler, the isolation cells. To further ensure the impossibility of escape, the Germans raised the wooden huts on concrete stilts, leaving a gap of 12 inches between the floor and the ground. This allowed the ferret guards, specialists trained to crawl under buildings with long steel probes, to look for the slightest sign of disturbed earth. The Nazis believed they had built an inescapable tomb for the Allied spirit, a place where the only way out was in a coffin or through the end of the war. But inside these wooden huts, a different kind of architecture was taking shape. The camp was a melting pot of the most brilliant, desperate, and restless minds of the Royal Air Force, the USAF, and their allies. These were men used to the speed of Spitfires and the heights of B-17s. Being grounded in a sea of mud and sand was a slow psychological death. The deadly boredom, tedio mortal, was a weapon the Germans used to erode the prisoner's will. The food was a calculated insult to human biology. The daily ration consisted of a thin, bitter ersatz coffee made of burnt acorns, a bowl of watery soup where a single piece of rotten turnip was a luxury, and a few ounces of Kriegsbrot, bread made with a high percentage of sawdust to bulk out the flour. This starvation was intentional. A hungry man is a tired man, and a tired man does not dig tunnels. However, the Luftwaffe had inadvertently created a university of resistance. By concentrating all the troublemakers in one place, they allowed a man like squadron leader Roger Bushell to organize them into a military machine. Bushell, a South African-born barrister with a glass eye and a cold, diamond-hard hatred for the Nazi regime, took command of the escape committee. He was a survivor of previous escapes and knew that the Germans were winning the game of cat and mouse because the prisoners were digging small amateur tunnels. Bushell changed the rules. At a secret meeting in Barrack 122, he announced a plan so massive it shocked even the most hardened veterans. "We're going through," he whispered, "and we're taking 200 men with us." He didn't just want an escape. He wanted to force the Germans to divert tens of thousands of troops, police and Gestapo agents away from the front lines to hunt them down. This was no longer about freedom. It was about sabotage. Bushell's strategy was based on the triple threat. Instead of one tunnel, they would dig 3 simultaneously: Tom, Dick, and Harry. Tom began in a dark corner of Barrack 123. Dick was hidden beneath the drainage sump in the washroom of Barrack 122. Harry, the most famous, was concealed under the base of a cast-iron heating stove in Barrack 104. The logic was cold and brilliant. If the Germans found one tunnel, they would celebrate their victory and relax their guard, never dreaming that 2 others were still inching toward the forest. But to build these tunnels, the men had to become ghosts. They had to move thousands of tons of that treacherous yellow sand without being seen. They had to scavenge and steal every piece of metal, wood, and wire in the camp, turning a prison of scarcity into a factory of ingenuity. As the first shovels hit the sand in April 1943, the physical toll was immediate. The tunnels were 30 feet deep, to bypass the seismic sensors. At that depth, the air was a thick, suffocating soup of CO2 and dust. The men, already weakened by malnutrition, had to dig while lying on their stomachs in a space barely 2 feet wide. Every time a guard walked overhead, the vibration would cause the ceiling to rain yellow sand into their eyes and lungs. The fear of being buried alive was a constant, gnawing presence. Yet they kept digging. They were fueled by a hunger that was more than physical, a hunger for agency, for the right to fight back and for the hope of seeing a world that wasn't defined by barbed wire and watchtowers. They were the architects of the abyss, and the Harry Tunnel was about to become the most expensive, most dangerous piece of real estate in the Third Reich. To call the tunnels Tom, Dick, and Harry simple holes in the ground would be a gross insult to the mechanical brilliance of the men of Stalag Luft III. These were not just passages, they were sophisticated subterranean veins of resistance, engineered to withstand thousands of tons of pressure, while remaining completely invisible to the surface. The first challenge was the depth. To bypass the Nazi seismic microphones, which were buried 9 feet deep, Squadron Leader Roger Bushell decreed that the tunnels must be dug at a staggering depth of 30 feet. At this level, the men were no longer just digging, they were operating in a different world. A world of crushing silence, absolute darkness, and a terrifying lack of oxygen. The Harry Tunnel, which began under a heating stove in Barrack 104, descended vertically through a shaft built with surgical precision. Every centimeter of the shaft had to be perfectly square, lined with stolen bedboards to prevent a catastrophic cave-in that would not only kill the digger, but collapse the barrack above. The engineering of the tunnel's walls was the greatest logistical nightmare of the operation. The yellow sand was essentially fluid. It had no structural integrity. Without constant shoring, a tunnel would collapse in seconds. The solution was the bedboard campaign. Each prisoner was issued about 20 wooden boards to support their thin mattresses. Under the direction of the X organization, every prisoner in the camp donated a portion of their boards. By the end of the project, men were sleeping on 3 or 4 boards, their bodies sagging through the gaps, held up only by blankets and sheer willpower. Over 4,000 bedboards were disappeared into the earth. To keep the Germans from noticing the missing wood, the ex-tailors created fake wooden slats out of paper and soot to fool the ferret guards during inspections. Every inch of Harry was a mosaic of stolen furniture, floorboards, and even stolen molding from the camp theater. As the tunnel stretched beyond 100 feet, the atmosphere became the enemy. In the narrow 2-foot by 2-foot crawl space, the carbon dioxide levels would rise so high that the fat lamps, primitive candles made from mutton fat skimmed off the soup, and wicks made from pajama strings, would flicker and die. The diggers would begin to lose consciousness, their lungs burning for air that didn't exist. To solve this, the engineers created a manual air pumping system that would make a modern engineer marvel. They scavenged empty Klim powdered milk tins, thousands of them, and soldered them together using lead stripped from the window frames of the barracks. This created a long, airtight pipe. At the base of the shaft, they built a bellows system using old kit bags and wooden valves. A prisoner would sit at the bottom, pumping the bellows for hours, forcing fresh air through the tin can vein to the man at the digging face. Without the Klim pipe, the Great Escape would have ended in a mass suffocation 30 feet below the Silesian pines. But how do you move 200 tons of sand without being seen? The X organization built a subterranean railway. They fashioned wooden rails and small trolleys with wheels made from stolen mahogany and reinforced with strips of tin. The trolleys were operated by a system of ropes made from unraveled sweaters. A digger at the face would fill a wooden box with yellow sand, signal with a tug on the rope, and a hauler at the base of the shaft would pull the trolley back. This Sagan Express allowed them to move incredible volumes of dirt in total silence. However, the sand still had to go somewhere. This led to the creation of the dispersal team. They built secret pouches inside their trousers, held shut by a string in their pockets. They would wander the camp as penguins, releasing the yellow sand into the grey topsoil and treading it in while they walked. They even built a secret garden where they claimed to be growing vegetables, but in reality, they were raising the ground level by several inches, burying tons of tunnel sand beneath a thin layer of lettuce and radishes. The darkness of the tunnel was absolute, broken only by the dim, flickering fat lamps. To improve visibility and morale, the engineers performed their most audacious feat. They tapped into the camp's electrical grid. A prisoner who had been an electrician before the war climbed the utility poles in broad daylight, disguised as a maintenance worker, and diverted a wire into the barracks and down the shaft. They stole light bulbs from the hallways and the guards' quarters. Suddenly, the Harry tunnel was illuminated. This was a double-edged sword. While it allowed them to dig faster and more accurately, it also meant that if a guard happened to look down the stove trap during a power surge, the secret would be out. Every day was a gamble with the gallows. The physical toll on the diggers was devastating. They worked in shifts of the damned. Because of the lack of space, they dug completely naked to prevent the yellow sand from staining their uniforms. When they emerged from the shaft, their skin was stained yellow, their fingernails were torn to the quick, and their eyes were bloodshot from the dust. They had to be scrubbed clean in freezing water by cleaning teams before they could appear in the camp for roll call. The psychological pressure was even worse. The sound of a truck driving overhead sounded like a thunderstorm in the tunnel. The vibration would send cascades of sand down, threatening to entomb them. They were men living in a grave they were digging for themselves, hoping it would eventually lead to the sky. By the time Harry was nearing the perimeter fence, it was a miracle of clandestine technology. It had a railway, an electrical system, a ventilation plant, and a shoring system that utilized every available piece of wood in the camp. But as they approached the wire, the tension reached a breaking point. The German ferrets were becoming suspicious. They knew something was happening. They could smell the fresh earth, even if they couldn't find the source. The X organization had to accelerate. They were no longer just digging. They were racing against the clock of the Gestapo. Part 2 ends at the most terrifying moment of the project, the day a German guard stood directly over the stove in Barrack 104, his boots inches away from the trapdoor, while 3 naked, soot-covered men sat in frozen silence 30 feet beneath his heels. While the diggers in the suffocating depths of Harry were battling the yellow sand, a different kind of war was being waged in the dim light of the barracks above. This was the war of the papermakers, the tailors, and the forgers. To Squadron Leader Roger Bushell, the tunnel was merely a door. What lay beyond that door was 500 miles of hostile territory, crawling with Gestapo agents, railway police, and a civilian population trained to spot an outsider. For an escaped prisoner of war, a tunnel only gets you to the forest. To survive the Reich, you need an identity. Thus, the X organization established Dean and Dawson, a clandestine travel agency and forgery workshop that operated with a level of precision that would have rivaled the German Ministry of the Interior. This was the factory of lies, and its mission was to manufacture the impossible, the perfect German citizen out of a starving British pilot. The forgers were the most protected men in the camp. Their eyes were their greatest weapons, and their hands, steady despite the malnutrition, were the instruments of survival. Working in hidden nests, tiny compartments built inside the walls of the barracks or behind false cabinets, these men spent 18 hours a day replicating the complex, multi-layered bureaucracy of the Third Reich. A single Ausweis identity card, or travel permit, required up to a dozen different stamps, intricate watermarks, and a signature that looked like it flowed from the pen of a bored Nazi clerk. They didn't have professional ink, they had to invent it. They crushed the tips of colored pencils, mixed them with stolen vegetable oil, and filtered the concoction through old socks. To create the official Nazi stamps, they carved the ends of rubber boot heels, or used the tops of stolen tins, etching the swastika and the eagle with needles stolen from the infirmary. The map makers were equally obsessed. Every man exiting the tunnel needed a map of the local railway lines, the borders of neutral Switzerland, or the paths through the Baltic ports. But there was no paper. The X organization organized a camp-wide paper drive, scavenging every scrap of tissue, every blank page from the back of a novel, and even the silver paper from cigarette packs. To replicate the maps, the prisoners built a primitive mimeograph machine. They used a frame made of bedboards and a stencil made of gelatin, a substance they extracted by boiling down the hooves and bones, found in the rare Red Cross meat parcels. One man would draw the master map, and they could pull 30 copies before the gelatin melted. They worked in a state of constant terror. If a ferret guard entered the room, the gelatin had to be eaten or destroyed in seconds. Then came the tailors. A man in a Royal Air Force uniform would be caught within minutes of leaving the woods. The 200 men of the Great Escape needed civilian suits, workers' overalls, or convincing German military uniforms. Under the direction of a former London tailor, the prisoners began a massive textile theft. They took thousands of blankets. Many of them dyed with boiled beet juice or wood stain to match the German grey or railway blue, and turned them into double-breasted suits. They used the needles from the medical kit and thread unraveled from the socks of their comrades. To make the buttons, they used polished pieces of wood or carved handles from toothbrushes. They even created leather suitcases out of cardboard boxes, coated with boot polish and textured with a comb to look like expensive hide. By the time they were finished, 200 men looked like a cross-section of European society, from traveling businessmen to peasant farmers. The psychological pressure on these factory workers was agonizing. Unlike the diggers, who could vent their frustration through physical labor, the forgers had to sit in absolute stillness, focusing their eyes on a one-to-one scale forgery while the camp sirens screamed and the ferrets prowled outside. The eye strain was so severe that many men suffered permanent vision damage. They had to account for the aging of documents. A brand new ID card would look suspicious, so they rubbed the paper against their own oily skin or used a light dusting of charcoal to simulate years of use. They also had to learn the German soul. The linguists in the camp taught the escapees not just the language but the attitude, how to stand, how to smoke like a German, and how to look a Gestapo agent in the eye with the perfect level of bored arrogance that would prevent a deeper inspection of their papers. The sheer volume of production was staggering. By the winter of 1943, the Factory of Lies had produced over 400 forged identity documents, 250 maps, and 50 complete civilian outfits. They had forged the signatures of real German commanders, copied the exact font of the Deutsche Reichsbahn, and even created fake membership cards for Nazi labor unions. This was the ultimate insult to the German state. Inside its most secure prison, the prisoners were manufacturing a version of Germany that was more efficient than the real one. They were literally printing their way to freedom. Every fake stamp was a middle finger to Hitler. Every blanket-turned suit was a rejection of their status as captives. However, the factory faced a devastating crisis just weeks before the escape. The Germans, sensing a plot, conducted a grand sweep of the camp, searching every hut simultaneously with hundreds of guards. The forgers had only minutes to hide their life's work. Some documents were hidden in the hollowed-out legs of tables. Others were placed in airtight tins and dropped into the sewage pits, the only place the Germans refused to look. The tension during that search was a cold, sharp blade. If the documents were found, the X-organization would be executed. But the stooges, the prisoner lookouts, did their job with perfection. They distracted the guards with fake fights, accidental spills of hot soup, and a chorus of mocking songs. The papers remained safe, but the close call proved that the Factory of Lies was running out of time. The paper was yellowing, the ink was fading, and the harried tunnel was almost at the tree line. The architecture of deception was complete. All that remained was the long, dark walk into the unknown. The night of March 24, 1944 was never supposed to be the night. The moon was too bright, and a late winter blizzard was howling across the Silesian plains, dumping layers of fresh, powdery snow over the camp. But squadron leader Roger Bushell knew the window was closing. The ferrets were closing in on the barracks, and the Factory of Lies could no longer hide the hundreds of forged documents and civilian suits. The order was given. Go tonight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, 200 men, the X-organization's chosen elite, began to filter into Barrack 104. They were dressed in their blanket suits, carrying their cardboard suitcases, and wearing their fake medals. Underneath the cast-iron stove, the trapdoor to Harry was opened. The air that drifted up from the 30-foot shaft was cold, damp, and smelled of wet sand and desperate hope. The first man down the shaft was Johnny Bull. His task was to dig the final vertical exit to the surface. For months, the ex-engineers had calculated the distance from the barrack to the tree line of the forest beyond the wire. They believed they were safe. But as Bull pushed his shovel through the frozen topsoil and poked his head into the night air, his heart stopped. The calculations were wrong. Instead of emerging inside the thick cover of the pine forest, Harry had fallen short. The exit hole was in the open, moonlit snow, just 30 feet from a German guard tower. The men in the tunnel could hear the crunch of the guards' boots on the snow above. The Sagan Express Railway, the Klimpipe ventilation, the 4,000 bedboards, all of it had led to a hole in the ground that was visible to the enemy. This was the moment the Great Escape almost died. A frantic whisper chain traveled back through the 350 feet of the tunnel. "We're short. We're in the open." Bushell, stationed at the base of the shaft, had to make a split-second decision. To cancel was to face execution anyway when the tunnel was inevitably found. To go was a suicide mission. He ordered a rope to be passed through the tunnel. One man would stay at the exit, hidden in the shadows of the trees, and pull the rope when the guard's back was turned. This signal system was the only thing standing between the escapees and a machine gun nest. For the next several hours, the escape became a rhythmic dance of death. A tug on the rope meant go. A man would scramble out of the hole, crawl through the freezing snow into the trees, and vanish. The physical conditions inside the tunnel were now a hellscape. Because the tunnel was so deep and the night was so cold, the Klimpipe ventilation system began to fail. The air became so thin that the fat lamps died, leaving the men to crawl in a pitch-black, suffocating tube of sand. The trolley system broke down as the rope snapped under the weight of the men's gear. Men were trapped in the dark, 30 feet underground, gasping for air, while the weight of the Third Reich pressed down from above. Some men suffered claustrophobic breakdowns, their silent screams muffled by the yellow sand. Every time a man got stuck, the entire line of 200 stalled. Time was hemorrhaging. They had planned to move one man every minute. They were moving one every 10. Then, the blackout happened. An air raid siren blared across the camp and the Germans cut the electricity. The stolen light bulbs in Harry flickered out. The tunnel was now a 350-foot coffin. Men had to feel their way through the dark, their hands touching the cold, damp bedboards that were the only things preventing the earth from reclaiming them. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Each man knew that if he tripped or slowed down, he was stealing the life of the man behind him. In the woods, the first escapees were realizing the horror of the weather. It was Tendency. Their civilian suits, made of thin blankets and beet juice, were soaking through with snow. They were supposed to be traveling businessmen, but they were shivering, grey-faced ghosts stumbling through a frozen wilderness. By 4 a.m., only 76 men had made it out. The 124 men still waiting in Barrack 104 knew the sun was coming. They were frantic, pushing into the shaft, desperate for their turn. But at 4:55 a.m., the nightmare reached its zenith. A German guard, deviating from his usual path, walked directly toward the exit hole. He didn't see the hole at first, but he saw the steam rising from it, the warm breath of 76 men condensed in the freezing air. As he peered into the dark, a man was just emerging. The guard's shout of "Halt!" echoed across the forest, followed by the terrifying staccato burst of a Luger. The 77th man, still halfway in the hole, scrambled back down. Inside the tunnel, the signal was clear. The game is up. The scene inside Harry and Barrack 104 became one of controlled, desperate destruction. Men began eating their forged documents, swallowing the maps and the ID cards they had spent months creating. They burned their civilian suits in the stoves, the smell of scorched wool filling the air. Down in the tunnel, men were frantically trying to retreat, crawling backward through the dark, their hearts pounding against the ribs of the narrow tube. When the ferrets finally breached the barrack, they found 124 officers sitting in their bunks, some still wearing 2 sets of underwear, looking at the guards with a cold, defiant silence. Outside, in the frozen forests of Silesia, 76 men were running for their lives. They had the forged papers, they had the Klim tin compasses, and they had a head start. But they were 500 miles from freedom, and the most feared man in Europe, Heinrich Himmler, was about to unleash a storm that would turn the Great Escape into a great massacre. The moment the 77th man, Flight Lieutenant Mick Shand, scrambled back into the darkness of the Harry Tunnel, and the German guard, Gefreiter Charlie Pilgrim, fired his warning shot, the machinery of the Third Reich didn't just respond, it convulsed. This was the single largest security breach in the history of the Luftwaffe. By 5:30 a.m., the phone lines between Sagan, Berlin, and the Berghof were screaming with the fury of a humiliated high command. This was not a mere prison break. It was a psychological decapitation of the Nazi sense of order. The Grossfahndung, the national hue and cry, was triggered with a ferocity that bordered on the hysterical. For the first time in the war, the internal security of Germany took precedence over the front lines. Over 70,000 men, regular police, Gestapo, SS Totenkopf units, the Landwacht, Home Guard, and even the Hitler Youth, were pulled from their posts. Trains were halted, borders were sealed with triple cordons, and every bridge, crossroads, and farmhouse in a 500-mile radius was turned into a checkpoint. For the 76 fugitives, the exit from the tunnel was not a transition to freedom, but a descent into a frozen, monochromatic purgatory. The blizzard that had masked their departure now became a relentless physical weight. The blanket suits, crafted in the factory of lies, were a triumph of tailoring, but a failure of insulation. As the men moved through the deep snow, the moisture from their sweat and the melting flakes soaked into the heavy wool. Within an hour, as the temperature plummeted to 15 degrees, the suits began to freeze solid. The men weren't just walking. They were carrying suits of ice that crunched with every movement, echoing through the silent, snow-muffled woods. Their Klim-tin compasses, masterpieces of clandestine engineering, became almost impossible to read as their fingers lost all sensation, turning into useless wooden appendages that could no longer grip a map or a piece of escape chocolate. The hard asses, those who had opted to walk across the country, faced a biological crisis that no amount of RAF training could prepare them for. They were already severely malnourished from years of sawdust bread and rutabaga soup. Now they were burning 6,000 calories a day just to maintain a core body temperature. Their lungs burned with the intake of the crystalline air, and many began to suffer from snow blindness as the morning sun reflected off the endless white plains. They resorted to eating raw, frozen sugar beets dug from the hard earth with their bare hands, the grit of the soil grinding between their teeth. Exhaustion manifested as a terrifying, waking delirium. Men reported seeing German guard towers in the clusters of pine trees and hearing the barking of bloodhounds in the whistling of the wind. The paranoia was an infectious disease. Every rustle of a branch was a Gestapo agent. Every distant light was a trap. Meanwhile, the train travelers were living through a different kind of hell, the hell of the social masquerade. Sitting in the second-class carriages of the Deutsche Reichsbahn, men like Roger Bushell and his partner Bernhard Scheithauer had to embody the perfect Nazi citizens. They sat inches away from Wehrmacht officers returning from the Eastern Front, breathing in the smell of stale tobacco and wet wool. Every time the sliding door of the compartment opened, the atmosphere became electric with a silent, screaming tension. They had to handle their forged papers with a bored, bureaucratic indifference, praying that the factory's ink wouldn't run under the nervous sweat of their palms. The ex-linguists had coached them to never speak unless spoken to, and to use the Sagan stare, a look of exhausted wartime irritation that discouraged conversation. But inside, they were screaming. They were pilots, men of the sky now trapped in a moving metal box, surrounded by the very monsters they had flown thousands of miles to destroy. The German response was a masterclass in totalitarian mobilization. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, was personally briefed every 30 minutes. He viewed the escape as a personal insult to the SS, which had recently taken over more control of the POW camps. He ordered the Gestapo to treat the escapees not as prisoners of war, but as saboteurs and spies. This was the legal loophole required for murder. The Sagan Order was being whispered in the corridors of the Reich Security Main Office, RSHA. It was a directive of pure, cold-blooded vengeance. More than half are to be shot. The list of 50 names was not chosen by chance. It was a selection of the most charismatic, the most skilled, and the most troublesome officers, starting with Roger Bushell himself. As the first 48 hours came to a close, the great hunt began to yield its harvest. The fugitives were being picked up in clusters. 2 were caught in a barn near the border, their feet so badly frostbitten that they had to be carried to the police station. Another was caught at a railway station because he tried to pay for a ticket with an obsolete version of the Reichsmark. One by one, the 76 were being funneled into the local Kripo, criminal police jails, and Gestapo transit cells. The capture was, for many, a moment of profound, tragic relief. The warmth of a jail cell and a bowl of real soup seemed like a blessing after the sub-zero agony of the woods. They laughed with their captors, shared cigarettes, and talked about the Harry Tunnel with a pride that the German police actually respected. They believed the game was over, and the rules would now apply. They had no idea that the rules had been incinerated in Hitler's latest fit of rage. They did not know that while they were being interrogated with coffee and cigarettes by the Luftwaffe, the Gestapo was preparing the black Opel cars and the Lugers. They did not know that the Sagan Order had turned their escape into a death warrant. As the trucks began to arrive at the prison gates to transport the men back to camp, the atmosphere changed. The polite Luftwaffe guards were replaced by silent, grey-faced men in leather coats. The Great Escape was transitioning into its final, most horrific phase, a systematic massacre that would turn the yellow sand of Stalag Luft III into a monument of blood. The execution of the Sagan Order was not a spontaneous act of war. It was a masterpiece of cold, bureaucratic murder. In late March and early April 1944, the 73 recaptured officers were scattered across various Gestapo prisons throughout Germany, Görlitz, Danzig, Munich, and Berlin. They were being held in a state of legal limbo, while the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, wanted them returned to the camp as honorable prisoners of war. The SS and Gestapo, under the direct command of Heinrich Himmler, were busy selecting the 50. This was a selection as cruel as any performed on the ramps of Auschwitz. The criteria were simple but devastating. The Gestapo prioritized the leaders, the master forgers, the linguists, and those with a history of defiance. Roger Bushell, the heart of the X organization, was at the top of the list. The ruse used by the Gestapo was as consistent as it was cowardly. The prisoners would be told they were being transferred back to Stalag Luft III or to a more permanent special camp. They were given their meager belongings and loaded into black civilian cars or small trucks, usually in groups of 2 or 3. The officers, relieved to finally be leaving the damp, overcrowded Gestapo cells, would often chat with their captors, expressing relief that the game was over. They had no reason to suspect that the Gestapo officers in the front seats had loaded Lugers in their pockets and a specific destination in mind, a quiet stretch of the Autobahn or a secluded forest clearing. The broken-down car ruse was the primary method of execution. As the vehicle reached a predetermined lonely location, the driver would suddenly pull over, claiming that the engine was overheating or a tire had gone flat. The prisoners would be invited to step out to stretch their legs or relieve themselves while the driver worked on the car. In the silence of the German countryside, as the officers stood with their backs turned, breathing in the fresh air of a freedom they thought they had reclaimed, the Gestapo agents would step out of the car, draw their pistols, and fire into the back of the airmen's heads. There was no trial, no priest, and no last words. The Great Escape ended not with a flourish of trumpets, but with the hollow crack of a pistol in a ditch. Roger Bushell and his partner Bernhard Scheidhauer were among the first to die. They were taken from the prison at Saarbrücken and driven toward the Autobahn. On a quiet stretch of road near Ramstein, the car stopped. Bushell, the man who had spent years fighting a secret war from beneath the sand of Silesia, was murdered in the grass by the side of the road. The Gestapo agents then performed their final bureaucratic duty. They cremated the bodies immediately. This was a crucial part of the cover-up. By burning the bodies, they destroyed the evidence of the entry wounds, proof that the men had been shot at close range while standing still. The official telegrams sent to the families and the Red Cross would all state the same lie. The prisoner was shot while attempting to escape a second time. The psychological horror of this period was felt most acutely by the 23 men who were spared. These survivors, including men like the legendary tunnel king WWII, who had been transferred just before the escape, were sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. They were kept in a special block, surrounded by the walking skeletons of the Nazi regime's victims. They watched as their friends were led away in pairs, never to return. They lived in a state of pre-mortem suspense, waking up every morning wondering if this was the day the black Opel car would arrive for them. They were witnesses to a slow-motion massacre, powerless to stop the machine that was grinding their comrades into ash. Back at Stalag Luft III, the atmosphere was one of a tomb. The X-organization, now led by those who hadn't escaped, waited for news. When the German commandant, Friedrich von Lindeiner, a man of old-school Prussian honor who was himself horrified by the Hitler's order, delivered the news of the 50 deaths, the camp fell into a silence so profound it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing. The prisoners realized that the war had changed. The gentleman's war between pilots was dead. The 50 were not just casualties, they were martyrs of a new, darker age of total war. To honor them, the prisoners began a clandestine project that would become the camp's final masterpiece, a stone memorial built with stolen cement and carved by the same hands that had dug the tunnels. As the fires of the Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, a new kind of war began, the war for justice. While the world was celebrating the victory in Europe, a small elite team of the RAF Special Investigation Branch, SIB, led by Wing Commander Wilfried Bose, entered the ruins of Germany with a list of 50 names. These were not soldiers looking for territory. They were justice hunters, looking for the men in leather coats who had pulled the triggers on the Autobahn. The Gestapo had tried to erase every trace of the Sagan Order. They had burned the files, cremated the bodies, and assumed that in the chaos of a destroyed nation, 50 dead pilots would be forgotten. They were wrong. The RAF investigators treated the murder of the 50 as a personal blood feud. They spent years scouring through displacement camps, changing their identities, and interrogating thousands of former Nazis to find the specific agents of the Gestapo and Kripo who had carried out the executions. The forensic trail was agonizingly thin. The only evidence the investigators had were the 50 urns of ashes and the suspicious identical death certificates. But they caught a break when they discovered that the Gestapo's own obsession with bureaucracy had been their undoing. Even as they were committing mass murder, they had kept duty logs of who was assigned to which prisoner transport. One by one, the killers were dragged from the shadows. Men who had tried to disappear into civilian life, working as bakers, mechanics, or farmers, were confronted with photos of the young airmen they had shot in the back of the head. The investigations revealed the sickening details of the Sagan Order implementation. They found that in many cases, the Gestapo agents had joked about the Great Escape while they were driving the men to their death, even offering them a final cigarette before the betrayal. The trials took place in Hamburg in 1947. 18 Gestapo members were charged with the murders. The defense tried to use the superior orders plea, the claim that they were merely following the commands of Hitler and Himmler. The court rejected it. The evidence showed that the agents had exercised a cruel level of initiative in how they carried out the broken-down car ruse. 13 of them were sentenced to death by hanging. The executions were carried out at Hamelin prison, the same place where many of their victims' final reports had been processed. It was a cold, clinical conclusion to a saga of warmth and ingenuity. But for the families of the 50, no amount of hangings could fill the void left by the loss of the most brilliant minds of the RAF. Meanwhile, the story of the 23, the survivors who weren't selected for execution, became a testament to the endurance of the human psyche. After being sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, they were placed in a special Sonderlager, special camp. They lived in constant fear, literally within sight of the crematoria chimneys. They were the living witnesses to the tragedy. Among them was the legendary tunnel king, WWII, who had spent more time under the sand of Silesia than almost anyone else. These men felt a crushing survivor's guilt. They wondered why they had been spared while men like Roger Bushell had been taken. They spent the rest of their lives documenting every detail of the escape, ensuring that the names of their fallen comrades would be etched into history. The post-war investigation also uncovered the internal German conflict regarding the massacre. It was revealed that many in the Luftwaffe, including the camp commandant von Lindeiner, were deeply ashamed of the Gestapo's actions. The German Air Force had initially tried to protect the prisoners, recognizing them as fellow aviators who had simply done their duty to escape. The Sagan Order had effectively destroyed the last remnants of military honor in the Third Reich. It proved that by 1944, the Nazi state had become a cannibalistic machine that no longer cared for international law or the consequences of its own barbarism. The search for the killers of the 50 took the SIB across 4 different countries and lasted until 1948. It was one of the most successful war crimes investigations in history, resulting in a near-total identification of the execution squads. The Great Escape had failed in its primary objective of getting 200 men to safety, but it had succeeded in something the Nazis never anticipated. It forced the world to look at the specific, individual humanity of the victims. Each of the 50 was a story, a family, and a future snuffed out. By hunting down the killers, the RAF ensured that the Great Escape was not just a story of a tunnel, but a story of a debt that was paid in full. The yellow sand of Sagan was now a site of pilgrimage, a place where the brilliance of the X organization would forever stand against the shadow of the Gestapo. The legacy of the Great Escape did not end when the last Gestapo agent was led to the gallows in Hamelin, nor did it end when the gates of Stalag Luft III were finally torn down by liberating forces. It lives on as the ultimate masterclass in the human refusal to be contained. Today, military organizations across the globe, from the British SAS to the US Air Force, study the X organization not just as a historical curiosity, but as the foundational blueprint for SEER, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training. Roger Bushell's genius was in recognizing that a prisoner of war is still a combatant. He proved that a man with a spoon and a stolen bedboard can be just as dangerous to a totalitarian regime as a pilot with a 1,000-pound bomb. By forcing the Nazis to divert 70,000 men to hunt them down, the 76 fugitives effectively removed an entire army corps from the defense of Germany's borders during a critical phase of the war. The Harry Tunnel remains the most famous 350 feet of earth in military history. In recent years, archaeological digs at the site of the former camp have uncovered the remains of the Klim-tin ventilation pipes and the rotted fragments of the wooden railway. These artifacts are more than just rusted metal. They are biological relics of a time when the human mind outperformed the most advanced security technology of the era. The engineers of Stalag Luft III proved that there is no such thing as an escapable prison, as long as the captives possess the 3 pillars of resistance: organization, ingenuity, and total self-sacrifice. They turned a desperate situation into a clinical industrial operation, proving that even under the threat of starvation, the human brain can function with the precision of a Swiss watch. But the true victory of the Great Escape was psychological. The Nazis intended for Stalag Luft III to be a place of deadly boredom, tedio mortal, that would rot the Allied spirit from the inside out. They wanted the prisoners to become ghosts of the forest, men without a future. Instead, the X organization gave them a purpose that was more intoxicating than freedom itself. Every man who participated, the penguins who shook sand from their trousers, the forgers who ruined their eyesight over fake passports, and the stooges who watched the guards for thousands of hours, was reclaiming his dignity. They weren't just digging a hole. They were digging their way back into the human race. They refused to be numbers in a ledger. They insisted on being architects of their own destiny. The tragedy of the 50 who were murdered by the Gestapo remains a dark stain on the history of warfare, but their deaths served a final, unintended purpose. The massacre horrified the world and ensured that the Nazi regime would be judged not just for its battlefield losses, but for its fundamental cowardice. The 50 became the eternal airmen, their names etched into stone memorials from London to Canberra. Every year at the site in Poland where the camp once stood, survivors and their descendants gather to walk the path of the Harry Tunnel. They don't walk it in fear, but in triumph. They walk it to remember that the angel of death was defeated not by a gun, but by the collective will of men who refused to stay in their cages. As we look back at the yellow sand of Silesia, we find the ultimate answer to the question of why they did it. Why risk the gallows for a hole in the ground? Why trade a safe captivity for a freezing death in the woods? They did it because the Harry Tunnel was a bridge between the darkness of the Reich and the light of the human soul. Roger Bushell, with his one eye and his iron heart, knew that a man who stops trying to be free is already dead. The Great Escape was a requiem for the brave, a story that teaches us that even when the walls are 30 feet deep and the guards are armed with machine guns, the mind remains an unmapped territory that no tyrant can ever truly conquer. The final image of this saga is not the black cars of the Gestapo or the frozen bodies in the snow. It is the image of a single Klim tin buried deep in the earth, still holding the air of 1,000 brave breaths. It is the image of 200 men who, for one glorious, terrifying night, were no longer prisoners, but free men walking through the pines. The Great Escape was a failure of logistics, a tragedy of bureaucracy, and a massacre of innocence, but it was the greatest victory of the human spirit in the history of the Second World War. The architecture of freedom stands forever, built on a foundation of yellow sand and the blood of those who dared to dream of the sky.